straight lines and columns, pediments. They had arches and columns. An arch, all that Romanesque. During the Middle Ages, they took a point at the top of the arch. It's called Gothic. Gothic, even though the arch itself is around the outer arch pointed. So they have this point at the top. Here on the right, you're going to see the four main cables of the Brooklyn Bridge disappearing from the anchorage down here. Now each of those cables has 500 miles of one steel wire in it. There's no way they could have made those cables and then put them up over the towers. They had those cables in place. It took about 18 months to make each of those cables. And a little wheel back and forth from anchorage to anchorage towers, and as went on, they spliced more cables. And like I said, it took a year each one. All these people down here are online for pizza. So here are buildings. These are all from that period around the Civil War era. Buildings with stars on them, like the ones in back of us to the right. That's from the Civil War period. There are the diagonal cables down to the roadway. And directly across the east. That's the South Street Seaport. This is chamber music here. And that's a real problem. It's been docked there, I think, for like 20 years. And this all just opened. This used to be all warehouses here, the Brooklyn Eagle warehouse. This is where I'm. Yeah, they film movies all over the city these days. Oh, it looks like it's in a cramped parking space. Go down and talk to the driver for a second. Were generally founded, in the early mid-1600s. The English started settlement colonies. They brought from England over. Started a business. They were not interested in starting a town or a colony or a settlement. They started trading outposts. Their focus was just on money. They didn't care who you were, where. In fact, the very first Amsterdammers were French balloons, who eventually became. So those were the very first New Yorkers, really. And by 1643, Lower Manhattan down there had a population of 500 people speaking 18 different languages. And extreme ethnic diversity has been more characteristic of New York throughout its entire history, right up until today. That's why we are different from every other city. That explains a lot as far as the labor pool goes. Really explain why New York City would be so successful economically. That has a lot to do with geography. And there are two main geographical features that had everything to do with that. If you look over the top of the bus, you can see the necklace, the main the Verrazano Bridge. 8 or 10 miles. You have to go under a mile and a half wide gap to get out to the ocean. Otherwise, you got to go all the way around Long Island, and it's about another 3 miles that you'd have to go around to get back out to the ocean. Now, the other reason, so you have this very well-protected natural harbor. Here's the east upper bay. If you go around the tip of the that's the Hudson River. And if you follow the Hudson River up about 150 miles, you come to Albany. And if you make a left at Albany, there is a natural passageway right through the Allegheny Mountains. No city could compete with New York City for decades, and that's when like sixfold. like I said, a lot cheaper, and you don't have any other crowds or the waiting. Now, the other role that Brooklyn Heights had in it was the very first commuter subway back in 1814. Where the Brooklyn Bridge is now, Robert Fulton began the first ferry service back and forth. And now instead of an hour, 20 minutes, which I don't know how, they say it took that long to row across. I mean, it's only a quarter mile, and it's running faster. But they got travel down back and forth between Brooklyn to 90 seconds. And starting in 1814, if you were wealthy enough, you could now afford to live is other than where you were. And during that period, that was a time from mercantilism, when people worked as cobblers, wainwrights as coopers, and you kind of right above your store, and you went downstairs to work, and you had your apprentice. That was a transitional period of about 20 years from like early 1800s until 1820s and 30s, when we were moving into to merchants and commercial businesses. And starting in 1850, people were living where they lived. And like I said, this was the very first commuter suburb. 1835, Manhattan had become the very first country town in history. I said that we don't venerate our past in New York City. Cities do, and ultimately that probably has to do with how we started by the Dutch as this very economically focused. Everything built in Manhattan was built on spec, just to make money. There are no homes left. Ones that were there, the NYC mansion where the mayor lived, a couple of the old museums that's left. The others had been separated by the grid when they laid it down that grid. If a street or a building did not have that grid, it was not. But we also had a lot of great fires in the city. 1770, during the Revolutionary War, I say that the British General Washington and the army out, half the city down, and it was probably a patriot who started the fire. Washington and his generals had considered whether they should burn down the city, knowing the British were probably going to take over. And they decided not to. But then once they did, they were glad that somebody burned down the city, because they didn't want the British to have a well-working city. But by that was in 1776, burned down half the city. 1935, there was a fire down here that lasted for 3 days. And 600 buildings, that's the last of the Dutch structures were down. It was the middle of winter, the fire hoses were frozen and put out with water. And the mayor was Mayor Opdyke, and this is really cool because you never envision your mayor like this today. He was very involved in trying to help stop. And they went around to the grocery store collecting gunpowder from, however, ounce from each store. And they came up with the idea the very first time to make this fire break. They couldn't fight the fire with water. And the buildings, was basically, and when I say wet, it's really not a very big building back in the 1830s. But it was all dry goods, with fabrics or tobacco or whatever. So they were just going up one after another. And for the very first time, they came up with the idea to make a fire break. And they took the gunpowder and they blew up buildings to create a fire break. And nobody died. Down there, it was the very first. It burned for 3 days. Firemen in Philadelphia and Connecticut saw the fire running after it, thinking it was in the next town, but it was actually all the way in New York. So there's Brooklyn Borough Hall on the left. We're not doing a whole lot of buildings around here. Aaron Burr is not the most favorable guy in history. He killed Alex in a duel in 1804. He's also the guy who started Chase Manhattan Bank. He did it under false pretenses. He said he was going to start a water. He got $2 million to the water company, but he used $100,000 to build the infrastructure, and he used $1.9 million to the bank that became Chase Manhattan. But anyway, he was a young New Yorker. He led those 5 groups north up the island along the Hudson River, single file, paralleling the British faster and reconnected with the top. So that was another close. But after that, they had the Battle of Harlem, which was a little skirmish, but the Continental troops. So it was a big morale booster. But after that, the Continental troops were off the island, and the British controlled Manhattan for the next 7 years. So another reason why we don't venerate our past. This, I just think, I never read this anywhere. But we had an entire population, 30,000 people. No other city in the occupied by a foreign power for 6 years. When the king came down before General town, and all the loyalists come back, and so what do? They did everything else. After the revolution, changed back. Loyalists had to get out. So that is preserving your history. You just have to see change on 3 times. Alright, so here's the skyline. Skyscraper is in the middle of the down at the tip. If you go into the park, you'll see this gray rock. Central Park is because this rock is so hard to excavate and deal with. Well, this rock goes right to the surface of Midtown there, skyscrapers are, and then it's a horseshoe underneath Manhattan. It's down a couple hundred feet. Garment District, and then at the tip, it comes right back up to the surface. Are up there, down at the bottom, but not in between. Right out there. Alright, so there's the Empire State Building. To the right of the Empire State Building is the Bank of America Tower. You can see the Chrysler Tower that's got that very stylized, top. To the right of that is the City Court Building with the slanted roof. And to the right of that is the Billboard Building. That's our mayor's building.
It's now like a paper.
I'm going to show you the factory. Alright, that's going to be good.
I remember people on monopoles.
We built all of our public housing along the river here. So a lot of this you're seeing here. We stole their land and turned it into lower middle class housing. Alright, so now the Bowery. Bowery, one of the most complicated roads to understand. Chinatown. Chinatown's on the outer surface. You're going to see buildings and Chinatowns all over them. Gradually start to buildings from the 1830s. That's when there were pastures around here. Alright, so now when you see with like 3 windows across business, they call that a counting house. But here's another typical old tenement. So, a typical old tenement. 4 windows across. Your apartment had 2 windows in the front or 2 windows facing the and that was the only rooms in each apartment. Only 1 room had the 2 windows. 2 interior rooms had no windows, light, or air. There's no running water until after 1901. And this is, so basically, warehousing people. And in the Jews, not only did your whole 6, 8, however many lived there, borders to help meet the rent. That's where they did the garment work. This place was more congested than Bombay was at its worst. When there were about 500 people living in this entire town. Now, if you look to your right, that's the Williamsburg. They depopulated this area. Barack Obama spoke to those guys from Goldman Sachs a few months ago, and that's where Abraham Lincoln gave a speech. It was called the Might Makes Right speech in 1860. That put him on the political. He gave that speech. No one had heard of him, but then they published it in all the papers, and then he was a viable political candidate for president back in 1860. So this is 4th Avenue, and in part of town we're going to see 4th Avenue actually turns to Park Avenue. Lexington and Madison are not numbered. They don't correspond. They're on the left. That's about church, and we're going to Union Square now. Union Square is called Union Square simply because this is where the Bowery and Broadway, which is just over there 1 block, come back together. Like I said, they both start right here at City Hall. They both go different directions. Basically, Broadway goes straight and comes out and comes back in. Union Square, they both come back again. Like I said earlier, when we we started the tour. One great crosstown street is 42nd Street. If you're going to pick South Running Street, Broadway would be a great street. You can see a lot of great things along Broadway. Us where we just were was Brooklyn, that's Kings County. It's actually attached to Queens County. There are two other counties, not part of New York City, called Nassau and Suffolk County. Counties, Brooklyn, Queens, Suffolk, make up Long Island. And Long Island goes 300 down to the Atlantic Ocean and ends at Montauk Point out there. If you went straight ahead off the top of Manhattan, you go over the river, and that's the Bronx. And the Bronx is the only, it's also called the county of the Bronx, the only New York City that's actually a continental mainland United States. 6th Avenue, and we're still in Ladies Mile, and this is where the elevated train had elevated trains on 2nd, 3rd, 6th, and 9th Avenues in the 1880s until like the 1940s. And this is where, because they had the train, this was for the middle class people, and you're going to see that these department stores were built with the elevated train in mind. Up here on the right, this is the old Cooper department store, and they were this department store until Macy's became Macy's. And you see the height of the first floor. The architectural detail does not begin until the height of the elevated train. Windows up there before people riding in the elevated train. On the left, the building, there were apartment school. On the right, was Gothic Revival Church and Limelight. This was a notorious club in the 1980s by Peter Gation. And Macaulay Culkin did the movie Party based on that notorious. Here on the left, this is a Trader Joe's now, but that was the original Abraham and Strauss. Again, that exaggerated first floor, that second floor, windows were for advertising, people riding in the elevated train. Alright, so now we're going to cross 20th Street. Now remember about Broadway, down in the problem with that part of town, they had the red light district right there down the side streets. They moved uptown after the Civil War. They figured things out a little bit better. Everything in front of is a high-rise residential. Those are condominium co-ops. By the way, the difference between a condominium and a co-op, a condominium is your apartment, like you buy your house, you buy your flat. If you're a co-op shares in the entire building, so you and everybody else owns the entire. Co-ops are much more called to fuss each other. Given the choice, you want to go. But anyway, those high-rise residential in front of us, and everything in back of us, 10, 12, 13 stories. District. This is not a historic district. They did not want to save any of these buildings, and that's because this was the red light district. The Tenderloin. The reformers called this part of town Satan's Circus, and they're still. You can look down the side streets. There's still some left from that period, and actually here right on the avenue. Here was a different level. Well, you have gambling at high stakes, 8th Street, low stakes, 27th Street, and you have rooms up here. And the people who made off on this were the cops. New York City then, again, this is like 1800s, not paid a lot. There's another old tenement there on the left. And they were almost to make up the difference on the graph. This was like the most secret. And the cops who work in this district, joke, would retire with mansions in Connecticut, yachts, hundreds of thousands of dollars in the bank. They said they got it from stock tips. The very first person to buy Yankees was the New York City in this district. And this went all up to 40th Street. Now we're coming up to, by the way, the main is really a alright, here's Macy's on the left. See the out there, Sunglass Hut? That was owned by Cooper Siegel. Macy's on that plot. See, it's not a Cooper Siegel refused to sell that plot to me. Didn't want to give them the satisfaction of having the entire plot. Square, James Gordon Bennett, the publisher, transformed publishing in a lot of ways, introduced all these new things. One of them was, he was the first guy to go to the scene of a report of murder. circulation went from 8,000 to 30,000 in one day. On the left, Savings Bank. And now, straight ahead, if you see the Fusion pinkish lettering on the right side up there, that's Rockefeller Center, and that's Radio City Music Hall. World War II, they had a station service at Radio, also at Grand Central. Radio City, they built, had a technology that the Navy needed, or the Air Force, I'm not sure which, aircraft carriers. The stage of Radio City was enormous, and it went up and down on hydraulics. The military actually needed technology for aircraft carriers, and they stationed Secret Service there to make sure that sabotage would happen until they could have technology. Grand Central, just down this street to the right, that's how they were moving up and down the and all the years, all the technology, the basement of granite, those tubes just direct the steam out from the ground and windshields so that they don't interfere with the drivers. Alright, so here on the left, that's the building, and back of us, this is the McGraw-Hill building. Actually, to the solstice and the equinox, so twice a year. Point to that. And this is the Exxon building up here on the left. This the corner, the block up ahead, doesn't look like anything else, and that they're called a spoiler. They did not sell it, so it's Rockefeller Center out there. And here, right, she went on a tour of these planters here on the right. They did a study. They spent thousands of dollars finding out how. So we're going to make a right here. Put your heads. Alright, now I'm a flick. Left here, folks. Chen's going to pull alongside, and that's going to be the end of the tour. It doesn't look like we're backed up. There's this Puff Daddy there. I wanted to show you. In back of us, there's a building. You can barely see it. It's not very tall. It's got the red roof there. His offices are in the corner of that building. That's Bad Boy Entertainment there. Right at that. I knew that billboard for years, and then it was later I realized, oh, that's why it's there. Alright, so folks, both Chen and I, we're both partially on tips, so there's a little bag. We appreciate anything we see tips. So yes,